kind of throughout the talk, we're really going to be talking about some of the kind of theoretical relationships between being a digital scholar and potential academic success, if you will. Now, we'll go into a little bit more about that after. So I think kind of my experience of running these types of workshops is that a lot of people will be contextualizing digital scholarship, whatever that might mean, in terms of how it fits into their academic agenda. And although digital scholarship is a very interdisciplinary topic area, I still think that there are a lot of different practices within the different disciplines that do vary. So a lot of you will be coming with different experience and backgrounds and ways of which you're going to apply this digital scholarship, whatever it is, to your practices. But really, I wanted to kind of pose the question, is it all worth it? Because I think as an academic, we're strapped for time. I think social media has become a bit of a novelty, and it's become a bit peripheral to the traditional forms of scholarship. And I'll talk about kind of ways in which I agree with that, and ways in which I really do disagree with that, and hopefully provide some evidence of it in practice, really. So I'm going to jabber for about 30-35 minutes, and then we're going to have a question and answer. However, I would really be happy if you put your hand up throughout and just kind of play devil's advocate and ask the questions that kind of feel like they're burning to you throughout. But as a starting point, digital scholarship is rather wide and vague. What is it? What constitutes it? Everything, right? From my experience of delivering these workshops and talking with academics throughout my time at the research councils, it means everything. It means digitizing your entire processes as a scholar. Whether that's the process of academic process, whether that's the process of communicating with students, via Twitter perhaps, or whether it's in terms of the dissemination of your academic output. Essentially, it's everything. And for me, I can see these ways of thinking and kind of process issues in two different ways. I think kind of digital scholarship is a process of shifting academic production online, shifting what you do in the real life onto a virtual medium. And I think it's an ideology, I think it's a way of thinking. Thinking and doing. It's a bit broad still, right? Very broad. So where do I kind of fit in? What am I going to talk about today? As Simon mentioned earlier, we have a series of talks around the IAMP, and we've had one already from a lady called Dr. Lorraine Warren, who's talked about her specific experiences of using digital scholarship, how she's used Twitter, how she's used blogs, how she's communicated and stuff like that. And I kind of wanted to take a very different approach, just to fill my individual niche. I want to look at a strategic perspective of digital scholarship. I don't want to get essentially into the nitty-gritty of how you use a blog or how you tweet or the type of tone that you might take whilst tweeting. And these are kind of born from my experiences running an RCDS workshop called the Becoming a Digital Scholar in 2014, early this year, and the conferences that I ran at the British Library called the Digital Research, which is essentially the only national conference for this type of stuff in terms of digital literacy. So, I want to look at strategic options, what's out there, and why should we bother? Is there any evidence that suggests why academics should engage with this type of stuff as a strategic vision for your research? Should you shift your process online? Should you have the ideology of becoming digital?
Oh, and I think at this point, actually, Mike and myself recently pitched to Richard Andrews, the Provost Chancellor for Research in this university. We pitched to him the notion of using this year's upcoming research conference, our university conference, on the theme of digital scholarship. I mean, I can't say for sure it's going to happen because we're in discussion, but you know, we pitched, well, mostly Michael's pitched, and I think that's likely to happen. So, you know, from a university's point of view, thinking about strategically, there are lots of things, you know, that we even are just glints in the eye. You know, I mean, I was talking to a guy over the weekend about his team, the commercial companies. They don't email each other. They have an in-house version of Facebook where they just sort of talk to each other in a sort of space. No emails. They're not allowed emails. So, and that, I thought, that was really weird. You know, but that's what I think you more meant about the process. But sorry to interrupt. But
No, exactly. But so shifting this approach, what kind of effects can it have? And I think most of us are pretty aware of being digital in terms of finding resources on the library, perhaps. That's something on the library. Finding secondary data, literature. Probably the most prominent speaker in this area, Professor Andy Meyer, quoted at this digital event I went to, "I find more resources through Pinterest, which is a particular forum online which is basically about uploading pictures, and Google Scholar than I do my own library." Sorry, sir. But that's what he said. And in terms of kind of these special interests, how to find kind of interest groups online and different information routes, you can see Twitter, LinkedIn, ResearchGate, and JISC, and some of you will be aware of some of these things and some won't. But for example, in Twitter, special interest groups happen via hashtags. You might be at a particular conference, and they might have a hashtag LSE digital event, and there will be conversations on there talking about specific special interests. In terms of LinkedIn, you've got discussion forums talking about specific things, and I know from my experience of being part of these special interest groups that I hear about calls for papers, calls for book chapters. In fact, I actually just put in a proposal for a book chapter purely from what I saw on LinkedIn. On ResearchGate, really interesting, you've got particular forums like normal, but you've also got kind of a question and answer type forum. So as an academic, I went on there and I said, is there any evidence that digital scholarship works? And within about 4 or 5 days, I had a whole stream of different links of people putting on, well, go to Nature Jobs, for example. Go to this journal, that journal. LSE does some great stuff. And, yep.
Do you know if ResearchGate is becoming the dominant player in that particular type of space?
Yeah, well,
there are competitors, aren't there?
Academia.edu has been the most popular,
right.
Because it's been around for roughly about 10, 11 years. ResearchGate's only popped up since 2009.
But it's doing well, isn't it?
But it's doing well because it's kind of gamifying this whole academic output.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so my experience with ResearchGate and academia.edu and that website, academia is more seems to be Europe-based, whereas on ResearchGate I get a lot of interest from kind of America.
Right,
That is interesting.
Yeah. Even I have ResearchGate and EDU, the other one, but I prefer ResearchGate, the other one.
Gives you a score.
Yeah.
It gives you a score. You answer a question, it gives you a score. Now, anyway, we won't talk about the nitty-gritty so much, because we could be here years. But in terms of JISC list as well, hands up who's heard of JISC? So does anyone kind of subscribe to any of the special interest email subscriptions? And do you find them useful? Yeah, kind of. They give you links to workshops, they give you links to papers, people who want to co-author and stuff like that.
Bit ye olde worldy though, isn't it?
It's very traditional, but it actually just shows that getting everyone on one email chain works as a network, and you can disseminate ideas. But I think if I was to go into the nitty-gritty of using different online profiles like these here, they all have their special purpose. And if I had about a whole day, I would talk about the specific purposes of each one.
Which we will have in the conference.
Oh, bit of promotion. Yeah, exactly. And just an example of how I've used Twitter as a research tool. At the research councils, I was responsible for kind of all of our strategic collaborations between all the national organisations. And what we did was we developed a whole Twitter feed by just following our 30 main stakeholder endorsers of our research and development framework, right? And by doing that, it was almost like kind of a live feed. We had a screen up on the wall, running through kind of JISC has now produced this report. The Leadership Foundation for Higher Education have now worked on this big leadership project. Actually, at that point, we were working on a leadership project ourselves. And it's just one of many examples of how we used it as an information source, we spotted an opportunity, and we contacted the CEO of the Leadership Foundation, and then we started working on a project like that. Would that have happened really if we would not have had Twitter? Maybe there would have been conversations, but Twitter allowed us to put our finger on the pulse and to get in these conversations, which is kind of pretty important. As most of you will be aware, kind of the impact in society is a new addition to the REF 2014. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's worth about 20% of the final submission now, which is a new introduction from the RAE to the REF, and that's set to continue for 2020.
It's likely to increase as a proportion.
Yeah. So yep. But in terms of impact on society, does these networks give you a greater dissemination of your work? Does it enable you to engage with that target population that forms the sample of your particular work? Do you get, and this is my experience, but a closer connection into the everydayness of this particular group that I'm looking at? So one of my case studies area was looking into the Olympic Borough of Greenwich, and I was just kind of tapping in 30 minutes every day, tapping into what they were saying in that local area during the Olympics, because I knew that I did start my PhD after the Olympics, but actually as a bit of prep, I started looking into these specific networks and seeing what they were saying, and actually it gave me a very good insight into what those communities were feeling, were impacted by this big mega event, and I've subsequently used some of those hashtags in these feeds as part of my data analysis. And I think this is a particular issue for me, and maybe some of you who are kind of critical theorists, but as a critical theorist, you could be it's a social and political position in which you place yourself, and actually one of the key components of being critical and being a critical theorist is that you invoke emancipation, social change, be part of social processes, and really how far can this emancipatory-led social change be helped by connecting with more people who form the fundamental target of your group. I think that's interesting. There's no research on that, but it was just a point that I had. If your ambition, and one of my contributions to knowledge is that I wish to invoke some form of project change, policy effect, I'm specifically talking about how these networks will help you do that. And the medium for sharing ideas, I'll quickly go through these, but ideas for a paper. Can you stimulate some debate? Are we personalising our own brand? Dare I say brand? I know that academics hate that word brand, but that persona online. Are you developing your own image? Stimulate a debate for something that you've just published. Ideas. I subscribe to a lot of blogs and from a lot of academics around the country, and I do look into some of the interesting academics in my area. I do look into kind of their conference experience, what they got out of the whole process, and is a blog a really good informal medium to kind of develop this personal persona? I went to a blog, maybe not I ate a cheese sandwich, right? But I went to a blog and I found this out. Would this be interesting for you? I don't know. Is it a good way to engage the public? And by this kind of, just thinking about Twitter, by retweeting interesting academic articles, do you help the circulation of academic production? Do you help expand it to your networks? What role do we play with in terms of sharing these form of ideas? And some of the methodological issues that you can use digital scholarship for. Again, these are just a few areas, but I've used it to access closed communities. I tried to knock on the door of businesses in Greenwich, and that was very difficult. That was really difficult. I didn't get much traction. I engaged a gatekeeper on Twitter, Mr. Greenwich, he was called, who was a bit of a spokesperson, a gatekeeper. And Mr. Greenwich retweeted some of my stuff, and then some of the other businesses in the area knew what I was doing, and it was kind of almost like that access into these areas. Can you do that by just walking in? Is it difficult to just send an email, a kind of a lonely email out there? Who's listening? You know, do these networks provide a way for the networks that you want to get into to listen? The amount of interviews I've organised on the way down to London via Twitter. I've had people kind of say, I've kind of done a little tweet, I'm going to be down in London today, who's around to have a chat? Organised about 8 or 9 interviews that way. Great for snowballing, and I think this is an interesting one. Accessing these really high-profile stakeholders. So, for example, I wanted to get in touch with the Economic Development Advisor for the Mayor's Office for London. So what I did, I tweeted, saw your recent 2014 Gov report. My research covers similar themes. It would be great to talk with you, right? And I sent that as a bit of an exploratory message. But everyone in my network in Greenwich retweeted this. And they were looking at the response from the Mayor of London. Was the Mayor of London going to respond to my request of meeting up, talking through this report? You know, these other people. Yes, he did, and I've done that so many times. I've used Twitter as a way of exposing these issues. Maybe if I just sent a closed email to the Mayor of London, maybe that wouldn't quite work. But with a lot of eyes watching, it has surprisingly quite a good effect. So, in terms of the strategic underpinning and everything, it's all down to these networks, whether they're local, regional, national, international, and you know, for example, Twitter and LinkedIn can be useful as a key source for developing your professional reputation, disseminating ideas, potential higher sites, views, downloads, bookmark publications, and I'll talk about some of the evidence that we've got for that. Publication calls, are you more likely to know what's going to be called out there if you're part of these networks? I believe so. Is there evidence? No. Is it logical? Yes. Connecting with individual academics. There's a professor in my area called Bent Flyberg, who is a huge professor at Sade Business School. Would I, if it wasn't for LinkedIn, would I have ever had the chance to communicate any of my ideas to Professor Bent Flyberg? No. He connected with me purely because my supervisor, Professor Chris Ivory, is also connected with him. And he was happy to add me. Now, every time he goes onto LinkedIn, he can see all the stuff that I'm blogging about, all the stuff that I'm talking about. The Digital Scholarship Conference, if it goes ahead, I'll make sure that Ben Flyberg knows about that conference.
Has he tweeted about this?
Say that again?
Have you tweeted about this event?
Of course. Yeah. Everything. Oh my
Please retweet.
So, co-authorships, public engagement, social impact, as I mentioned before, connected with policy and practitioners, like I said, for the critical theory before, which is also important, even if you're not a critical theorist. Joint bids, special interest discussions, and you know, this list kind of goes on in terms of what can be the output of being part of these networks. Essentially, it's about being part of these social conversations. But I think social media sounds a bit chit-chatty. And speaking to academics about this sort of stuff, they see it as, well, it's not very professional, is it? But actually, there are professional conversations happening in social spaces. And it's blurring this formal versus informal line of conversation, which is inevitable using social mediums. So instead of thinking about it as chit-chat, I just kind of think about it as an extended version of an academic conversation, as long as you get into the right networks. So the benefits are that you kind of keep your finger on the pulse, and you just do something called signaling. You you understand all the beams and signals that are out there, and if you filter this type of information well through different networks, then you can really have your finger on the pulse. Oops, hopefully this is going to work. But I think digital media has a problem, and this whole digital scholarship, and that is the fact that it's so complex. And actually, again, from speaking with other academics about why they don't use it, they go, well, there's way too much jargon. It takes way too much time, not just to nurture networks, but to get set up and to find the right people. And then, on top of all that, I've got to turn my real academic world into a digital academic world. I think the argument isn't there for academics to use it, right? I don't think so. And that's a problem. And I think we need to address it, which I'm not going to address now. But essentially, all social mediums do talk with each other. And I think that's going to be a talk for the Digital Scholarship Conference. But in terms of the complexities, I just want you to kind of see if you reflect on how far your digital world sounds a bit like this.
Derek is proud to announce that we're partnering with a new venture that will literally change the way you think about the internet.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Gink.
What is Gink? Gink is a revolutionary web portal that will change the way users interact with other users.
Gink is a revolution in the way web users interact with one another.
Gink is a fun made-up word, combining the words gibble and spink, both of which are also made up.
A lot of people say I love Facebook, but what Facebook doesn't allow me to do is connect with friends.
So we took the appeal of Facebook and added the ability to connect with friends. And that's when the fun began.
Gink allows users to accumulate gig points, or goinks. Users can exchange points with other users, and in return, they receive quimbles.
There are 7 default quimbles. Users can express their creativity through user-generated customizable quimbles.
Users can customize their quimbles by adjusting attributes such as bump level, amount of squiggles, and blorkability.
Never before have users had this level of control over the blorkability of their quimbles. And I think that's part of what makes Gink so exciting.
A lot of people say I love YouTube, but what YouTube doesn't allow me to do is share and view videos.
So we took what YouTube does and added the ability to share and view videos. Then we replaced the videos with something called Schmorkel links.
And that's where the fun began. Imagine being able to email a Schmorkel Blinks to your grandma in Tucson, or live ginking a Schmorkel directly to your Blinks page.
And the more Schmorkels you Blinks, the higher your Steam rating.
We haven't even gotten to the Gorks yet.
Oh my god, the Gorks. So if your Schmorkel makes it to the top of the top Blinks list, you gain the ability to create and edit Gorks.
Now what are Gorks? Well, imagine the biggest groove you've ever seen. At a pinch of spimple, you've got yourself a Gork.
Gorks are grooves, Gink style.
Some of you might be wondering, what's the difference between a Gork and a Blork?